Welcome and thank you for listening to the Civic Space today with Southern Defenders. In this podcast, we explore the status of the civic and political space in the Southern Africa region. We unpack critical issues that shape the space. My name is Mantate Mlotshwa and I am your host. In celebration of Pride Month, I am joined today by Sputla, co-director of the Botswana Trans Initiative, BTI, to delve into the crucial work being done to support and protect trans and gender diverse individuals in Botswana. We will explore the birth of BTI, the personal journey that inspired its creation, and the organization's efforts in advocacy, legal reform, movement building, and public education. Sputla's dedication to advancing the rights and well-being of the trans community offers valuable insights into the challenges and triumphs of promoting inclusivity and equity in Southern Africa. Sputla, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So maybe we can start by having you introduce yourself, tell us a bit more about who you are and a bit about the Botswana Trans Initiative.
Thank you so much. My names are Sputla, preferred name Sputla, and I am currently the co-director together with Nelly Tobeja of the Botswana Trans Initiative, which was founded in 2021 and formally registered in 2024, February of this year. BTI's mission is basically to advocate for the rights and inclusion of trans and gender diverse persons in Botswana, looking at different thematic areas of public education and awareness, advocacy around legal and policy reform, movement building, as well as research and documentation around trans and gender diverse rights.
And you also mentioned that BTI's journey started with personal experiences, maybe sharing a bit more about your journey and how it inspired you starting BTI.
I think for both Nelly and I, it was mostly encouraged by the personal experiences that we were both going through, and having found ourselves in a space where there was a lack of representation around trans and gender diverse issues and persons. It was very imperative for us to also build that safe space for ourselves as well. Relatively speaking, from my personal experience, it has been very, very hard for me to maneuver, the spaces of, issues of sexual orientation, gender identity, especially in terms of, my family and just people around me who I thought would be very much encouraging, but that was not essentially the case. So I had to find ways to bring myself closer to the conversation and allowing myself to explore ways of, surrounding myself with positive people who are aligned to, my kind of life and how I want to be represented in different spaces.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And how has your personal story influenced the approach that you take to advocacy and the work that you're doing?
I think the most important thing for me was basically seeing the representation of trans people in different spaces, mostly around, issues of visibility, because the biggest thing that we always got was, are you a confused group of people, right? And allowing ourselves to raise awareness on issues like that and the challenges that we face as trans and gender diverse people in this country allowed me to be more expressive of who I am and also understand the dynamics of what essentially means to be a trans and gender diverse person in the country.
BTI focuses a lot on advocacy and legal reform. Can you maybe discuss some of the significant legal policy challenges that trans and gender diverse individuals face in Botswana?
I think in terms of, the advocacy and legal reform in Botswana, if maybe some people are aware and maybe some are not, we've had two cases that had set precedents in terms of, the issue of the legal gender recognition of trans and gender diverse people in Botswana. And unfortunately, as we currently stand, there hasn't been any, form of administrative process from government to say, well, this judgment came out and this is what we are looking at in terms of, protocols and guidelines that speak to legal gender recognition for trans and gender diverse people. And this has also led us to, in terms of our advocacy work around legal and policy reform, has brought us to a space where now our advocacy is more legislative, more than public campaigning as other organizations are doing. And I think the conversation had stand around, if at all our administration or our high courts have set out this precedence, what does it mean for trans and gender diverse people in the country? And we still find that our communities are still struggling in terms of access to gender marker changes, for example, access to hormonal therapy, for example. And this has also been some kind of driving force for us to say, what kind of issues are we speaking to and who are we speaking to on these issues? The issue of legal challenges, the issue of legal recognition, the issue of discrimination in employment or barriers to access to healthcare, for instance. There are no particular provisions that speak to the gender marker. And just recently, I think Parliament should be taking up an amendment bill that speaks directly to intersex people, but is exclusive of transgender diverse persons. And this is a conversation that we are currently trying to bring to the table, to say the issue of legal gender recognition does not only speak to intersex persons, but also inclines, the conversation around legal gender recognition for trans and gender diverse persons.
And then when you're looking at, for instance, you gave examples of the two cases in Botswana. Are there countries in the Southern Africa region where there's been cases that have set a precedent and some form of administrative process took place afterwards that maybe Botswana can learn from?
I think currently looking at the SADC region, I think South Africa has been more progressive in those terms, particularly to trans and gender diverse persons. But South Africa has really good policies in place, but we don't fully get the essence of, what it really means to be fully authentically yourself because they currently go through, a lot of hate crime issues, a lot of misunderstanding, misrepresentation of trans and gender diverse persons. So as BTI, we are trying to also look at other risk factors that may come with us being able to push this mandate forward. And I think in that essence, the biggest thing that we currently are looking at is mostly around the social exclusion, the influence that media has, and also the administrative, legislative prospects that the country may look into when, looking at changing or amending some of these policies or bills to address some social injustices.
Like you mentioned media, and that's something that I'd not planned to speak into, but I'm also wondering, like, if you're looking at the evolution of media over the years, do you think that the different forms of media, especially digital social media, has somehow provided more platforms and spaces for advocacy? Or has it in any way bettered the spaces for the trans and gender diverse people? Or have you seen it bring actually more of the challenges?
I think where we are as well, because initially with BTI, the first 2 years of our existence was mostly trying to build relations with different stakeholders, understand the scope really of where the country is, what is happening and doing what. And I want to be very sure that we have been able to do so. And I think in specifically speaking to the media aspect, we are making a few small strides. We do have platforms that speak positively of trans and gender diverse issues, but we also in the same light still have a bit of a reluctance in some spaces. For example, representation on podcasts and online social media, for example, that speak to where we have people speaking to issues of diversity in all its different forms. But in terms of the bigger stake of it all, in country, our media hasn't really stepped up to the table to represent, marginalized groups as we would hopefully, see as a progressive move for us and for them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I understand. And maybe when you're reflecting on the BTI journey, what have been some of the notable successes in lobbying for inclusive laws or challenging discriminatory practices?
I think our biggest challenge is mostly around, who we engage, because most of the time, as I was speaking earlier, we try mostly to engage with legislative and administrative, personnel, but the lack of receptance from them gives us a very big challenge, because we find that if we are trying to address issues of, let's say, the gender marker with the civil and national department, for example, it is very, very, very hard for us to be able to get into those spaces if we do not have some sort of entry point to that space. I think also maybe just to mention some positive responses that we've been able to get was particularly with the Ministry of Health, where we made sure that in building our relationships, we kind of enforce the fact that these are people's lives and people should be allowed to also, allow themselves to live authentically. Maybe speaking also to the issue of, right to health for all. That is one other form of approach that we had used with the Ministry of Health to say, can we have these conversations? Can we put these conversations on the table and figure out strategies that could work for both of us as the Ministry of Health and Botswana Trans Initiative. And I think from a positive light, we have been able to get one step into that door, and it has been a very, very progressive relationship for us with the Ministry of Health.
I like that. And I think it's good that we're able to see like the positives, especially within the ministry, because it then gives this indication that there are more government department ministries that would actually jump on board, because we're seeing some actually doing it. And you spoke earlier about just how the Botswana Trans Initiative journey started from a place of needing a safe space for yourselves and for other people. So what kind of initiative has BTI been implementing to build that strong, safe, supportive community for trans individuals?
I think for the longest time, because the visibility and representation of trans people has kind of like a little bit non-existent, because for the most years we've been overshadowed by, issues of sexual orientation rather than directly speaking to gender identity and the misconceptions that come with that. Our biggest thing has been to try and upraise the visibility of trans persons in Botswana. And for us, having been able to do this was through our movement building initiatives, which include, supporting initiatives of mental health issues, supporting our own constituents or beneficiaries in terms of, that socio-economic empowerment initiatives. We don't directly speak to service provision, but us being able to have conversations with the biggest stakeholders, our ministers, our, other government offices allows us to create that representation aspect. And I think our community has learned now to be able to speak for themselves, whether in a space of where they feel discriminated, whether they feel misrepresented in any way. And I think we've been able to empower our community to be able to understand what their human rights issues are and how they can use it to better, their lives, their livelihoods on a daily basis. And I think the other thing that has been able to assist us in trying to build a solidified movement was building relationships in country with organizations that have been already doing the work, and also trying to find intersectionalities that speak to the work that we all do. The biggest thing that I think has been working for us is creating documentation and what word can I use? It's not particularly research, but community-led monitoring initiatives that speak directly to trans and gender diverse issues and other marginalized groups as well. And our community-led monitoring aspect stems from access to healthcare, particularly for trans issues, where we have a platform called Mabox, where trans people are able to give online real-time feedback on a platform when accessing healthcare from any facility that they may seek. But currently we are working with just a few less number, I think about one clinic currently, and this has also showed us how much influence or how much change our own documentation and our own leading initiatives can help us achieve some of these other challenges or gap up the challenges that we are experiencing as transgender and diverse persons.
I love this. I love the emphasis on just building on the relationships that can exist within the community and just tapping into the people that have already been doing some sort of work. And this podcast basically focuses on the Southern Africa region. Part of what we're trying to do is to reflect on some of the ways in which different things are working in different countries that can be adopted in other countries in the region as well. So as you're looking at solidarity within the Southern Africa region for trans and gender diverse individuals' interests, what does solidarity look like, and how would you want for it to look?
I think firstly, for me, it stems mostly from how we view each other, the level of respect that we have for each other as a community, particularly also looking at, the kind of work that we do. So solidarity for me is mostly around being able to work together, being able to commit to each other's work, and being also able to, represent each other in spaces that, some of us cannot reach. And maybe speaking to some of the regional partnerships that we've been able to build, we have working relations with different organizations across the region, from South Africa to Lesotho to Namibia, even if it's not fully engaging by being present there, but sharing the statements, sharing the anything that maybe happen within our context has really proven that the solidarity support around our region still has more and can still do more. And I think building all of those movements together and creating networks that solidify our movement to create safe spaces and support networks is a very crucial thing. And I think also building or implementing strong, supportive communities for trans and gender diverse people creates a very solidified movement for our communities. And this was also kind of fosters a lot of belonging and empowerment, if I may put it that way, within our communities, whether you go across border, whether you are within your own country, having that understanding that if Botswana is in trouble or is going through something, South Africa is able to support, Namibia is able to be present, Zambia is able to be there. So I think for me, solidarity means being able to connect with each other, not necessarily looking at the different challenges or the specific challenges that we might have, but being able to support every cause that is challenging for the marginalized groups in our different spectrums.
I love that. I love that so much. And I hope that, we can continue to see that grow beyond just, Southern Africa, and also just continue across the continent, and also just globally through the networks that we have. I know that you mentioned earlier that you're not currently focusing on public education, but more legislative advocacy. But I was wondering, in what ways, or how does your work then get to the public that are outside the community that you're directly serving?
We are focused on public awareness and education and campaigns, but we do it at a very, because also we are a new organization, we are still trying to get our footing right in terms of how we want to relay messaging as well. The biggest thing for us in terms of public education is mostly around trainings and workshops. This is particularly directed to the policy makers and healthcare providers that we are sickly, some of our thematics areas are directly connected to. And I think our public education and awareness stems from that, because generally we always speak about, sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, and expression. That's like the SOGI 101 for everyone, right? But as we elevate our work more, our advocacy more, we try and look at, what is it that we want the society to see us for? What is it that we want, reflected towards our own society? So our biggest challenge now is getting to the society. We understand that, societal change or mindset change is a big thing. And if we leave our communities behind, it becomes, there's a whole gap that happens between, our administrative processes and the people that we surround ourselves with every day. Hence, we also try and acknowledge that it may come with a bit of risk of, human rights violation or any other violation that people may experience out there. So we try by all means to intersect with other organizations, whether disability organizations, whether ethnic issues, whether indigenous issues. So we try and interconnect our campaigns through all of other issues of sustainable development, and how does the trans and gender diverse community fit in those spaces, and what does it really mean to be involved in some of those spaces.
Thank you so much, and I 100% agree, because I think the other thing that we always need to have at the back of our minds is the fact that when people are done going through the workshops that we do with them and for them, they're going back to those very same communities who, if they're not given the knowledge and the awareness that they need, if we don't try and change their perceptions, again, it's going back to communities that are resistant to whatever it is that we're providing. So I love the fact that you're focusing on the communities themselves. And I know, like you've indicated already, that there's a lot of intersectionality in the experiences of the trans and gender diverse individuals, but also in the way that you approach the advocacy, the work that you do. Maybe expand on that for people that may not understand some of the intersectional ways in which the space exists for you.
Intersectionality, I think, recognizes multiple and overlapping layers of, stigma and discrimination that, some individuals may face. The issue of, race, for example, let's say, for example, as a Botswana person, I do not have access to hormonal therapy, right? But you'll find that somebody who's a different race, for example, a white person, will easily get access to that particular service, right? And this also calls for that intersectional approach for us to be able to address some of these issues without also discriminating on other people, right? The issue of socioeconomic status. As a new organization, we are based in the capital city. How do we get people in the rural areas to have access to information? Firstly, we talk about digitalization as one of our sustainable development goals, but we do not address those issues in rural spaces, unfortunately. And getting information to people, for example, becomes very, very much more difficult. We have trans people who don't even understand the terminologies that is being used. So how do we interconnect all of those issues and complexities? So I think BTI tries to somewhat tailor our programs to meet diverse needs. Like I was saying, we are still a very small organization, and these are some of the works that we want to put as part of our programming aspect. And we hope that in the next maybe 2-3 years, we'll have proper frameworks that will be able to address some of these intersectional issues. Issues of inclusive advocacy. How does that look like? What does it mean for marginalized groups or marginalized, economic backgrounds, for example? So yeah, I think we are looking at that.
No, thank you so much for thinking about it in that way, but also for explaining it in ways that are very easy to understand for anyone that's listening. And I would love to know, like, reflecting on your journey with BTI, what has been the most rewarding part of your work?
Belonging in a community where, we have now a good number of trans people who are coming out just to, appreciating the work that BTI has been able to do, especially as a young organization like we are. And I think a lot of community feedback that speaks directly to the work that we are doing and how we've been able to assist. As much as we're not able to get the end results now of us being able to get, access to, let's say, gender affirming healthcare, for example, but the acknowledgement of the community as we always give them feedback about these meetings that we go to or these conversations that we have, is always a joy to see when, trans people are in a space and are happy about whatever work that we are doing. And I think also the most important part is creating the safe spaces for our trans communities, creating the safe spaces in a sense that, we should be looking at mental health well-being of our communities. We should be looking at the socio-economic aspects. We should be looking at the education aspects. We should be looking at unemployment issues. And I think in the little time that we've existed, we have been able to somewhat touch on some level of empowerment for our own communities. Yeah.
I think anyone that's been listening from the beginning can actually see from when you started and say this was the vision, we're trying to come in and ensure representation. And that's exactly what you're doing. You're pushing for representation of the trans and gender diverse individuals, but you're also pushing for the safe spaces. So we love to see you just showing up and doing the work, and we hope that you continue to grow. You mentioned that there are some personal challenges that you faced with your own family as you started out on this journey and potentially are ongoing. But what are the other challenges that you're facing personally as a leader in this space, and how have you overcome them?
So it's a bit tricky because having been in the movement for the past possibly 10 years or so, from being a volunteer to now where I am, there is a lot of work that still needs to be done for our movements in terms of how we relate to each other and how we address some of these issues. And I think the biggest challenge is having people understand why you are doing this work. Because we similarly get, oh, you're just in the human rights space because there's money there. You are just in the human rights space because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And then another thing that has also come to be very, very interesting is the gatekeeping that happens around, the work that we do. We have all the organizations that have been in existence for over 20 years, and you being able to get into spaces that you need to be in or create representation that needs to be there. There's a lot of channeling that you need to do when you try to maneuver around these things. And then the other biggest thing is the lack of funding for trans and gender diverse issues, resource allocation for our work or for our own communities to be able to advance human rights for transgender persons. As much as we do community or movement building for our communities, there is also that little back resistance of our own communities because of some of the stigma and discrimination within our own marginalized groups, and people understanding the different dynamics and diversities that we have to acknowledge when dealing with marginalized groups.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And is there anything else that you'd like to share about BTI or your personal journey that we haven't covered?
I think most importantly on my end, it's for me on a personal end, like I mentioned earlier, I had a lot of problems with, how I engage with my family and having them understand me. But I think this year has been quite an interesting year for me, having a religious pastor as a father, and also, having them attend a religious, spiritual LGBTIQ training for like 3-4 days, and having them come out of there as a progressive man who understands a bit of diversity has been quite interesting for me, and how he's now, how he views me now has become a bit more different from, our initial conversation. And the idea of him acknowledging that the lack of knowledge has been the biggest thing on his end, this has been a very, very impactful thing for me. And this also has encouraged me to do more work around, parents and families, religious and climate and so forth. So yes, this has been a big highlight in my life this year. And I'm very, very happy with the man I call my father. And then in terms of BTI, I think the direction that we are on now is very progressive because we all understand that our governments they can be very reluctant in terms of how they address some of these issues. And the fact that we've been able to get into spaces and also build very positive relationship with our government kind of also help us understand some of these issues and what really inclines us to be doing this work. And I think also just witnessing some of the positive changes that we've seen with, our own communities, our own trans individuals, has been very, very much exciting in terms of how people are able to gain more confidence. People are able to, access healthcare, necessary healthcare, even if, because they now understand some of the, human rights in terms of access to services and all of that. And I think it's been a very, very incredibly fulfilling for us to be able to, even if it's not a whole lot of people, but having seen the change 2 or 3 or 5 people means a lot for us as well. And I think it also builds in us trying to transform and help create more inclusive societies, because when you have communities who are able to stand up for themselves, it makes it easier for them to be able to converse with the rest of the community or mainstream community. Yeah.
I love this so much. I think it's a very powerful way of ending the conversation, because I think the bigger reflection for me is just seeing the learning happen, because that's the whole point of the work that you're doing, ensuring that there's a lot of learning within your community, but also within the broader society. And in learning, it begins to shift the way that we look at the community, but also the ways that we engage about issues that affect the community. So I actually love this as a way of ending the conversation. How can our listeners get involved or support BTI's mission?
You can get a hold of us on Facebook and Instagram, Botswana Trans Initiative, and then email at botswanatransinitiative@gmail.com. Yeah, I think anything else we can get more information on that as well, because I feel like if people are aware of the work that we do, it will be easier for us to talk, about volunteering, about spreading awareness, about participating in events, how to use our voices in helping us advocate and support trans diverse rights and inclusion.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Sputla, for your time and insight. This has been very interesting. I've learned so much, and I know that our listeners as well have learned something. I think it's a powerful way as well to close, to wrap up Pride Month, even though the issues that we're speaking about across this month are not ending here. They're continuing forward. So thank you so much for making the time to be a part of this conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. And a special thank you to all our listeners. We'd love to hear your feedback and thoughts on today's episode. Leave us a comment on the platform you're using to listen to this episode, or tag us on a post on social media. Remember to share this podcast and follow Southern Defenders on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can visit our website, www.southerndefenders.africa, to get a broader sense of the work that we do as Southern Defenders. This is the Civic Space Today, a program of the Southern Defenders. I am Mantate Mlotshwa, your host for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in and see you next time. Together, we defend.